And we are live! Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery! We have got our live virtual studio audience joining me on Zoom, and wherever you are watching from, we are entering into the exciting new world of Masechet Bechorot. Masechet Bechorot. Ladies and gentlemen, this is fantastic. This is a brand new Masechta. And we are going to be starting tonight, hopefully going through chapters 1 and chapter 2 as well. And that's it's only got 9 parakim in it, 9 chapters. So hopefully 3, maybe 4 weeks worth of shiurim, and we'll already be moving on to a new one. So without any further ado, guys, we're going to get the words up on the screen for you, and we're going to get underway with the brand new Masechta, Mishnah Bechorot, which talk about 3 different types of Bechorot. We all know what a Bechor is, don't we, guys?
Firstborn.
Firstborn. So we're going to be talking about 3 different types of Bechoros. In this particular order, we're going to first talk about the firstborn donkey. And the firstborn donkeys would be redeemed for a sheep, and it would be given to a Kohen. We are also going to be talking about the Bechor Behema Torah, the kosher animals which need to be redeemed as firstborns. And those would be sheep and goats and cows. Bakar v'tson, sheeps, goats and cows. And if they were unblemished, then a Kohen would bring them as a korban, as a sacrifice. And if they were blemished and not fit to be brought up on the altar in the Beis HaMikdash, then the Kohen would get to eat these animals, but with certain stringencies applied. And then the third and final type of Bechor is none other than
Children.
That's right, Pidyon Haben. The mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, which is the concept of giving 5 coins, 5 slaim, to a Kohen. So first of all, in chapter 1, we are going to be dealing with the Pidyon Peter Chamor. Peter Chamor is the phrase, the term that describes the redemption of firstborn donkeys. So that's going to be our first topic of conversation in this opening chapter. So that's what we're going to be talking about to start with. Now, with regards to the Bechor, to these firstborn donkeys, it's only going to apply to animals that were owned exclusively by Jewish people, by Jews. So says the Mishnah, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, chapter 1, Mishnah 1, Halokeach ubar chamoro shel nochri. A person who buys the ubar, the fetus of a donkey, from a non-Jew, V'hamochelo, and one who sells a donkey or the fetus of a donkey to a non-Jew, afal pi she'eino rashai, even though you're not actually halachically allowed to sell in Eretz Yisrael these animals to a non-Jew, and that's because it might end up being that if I'm not mistaken, that the non-Jew will use the animal for doing work on Shabbos, and then it's going to be mistaken to think that it was actually your animal and he's doing work for you on behalf of you on Shabbos, etc., etc. So the sale would nonetheless be valid, and we'll see where this halacha is going. So a donkey that has been sold to a non-Jew, even though you weren't supposed to have done it, you have done it. Or you have partnered up with a non-Jewish person in the ownership of a donkey or its fetus. V'hamakabel mimenu, one who receives a donkey from a non-Jewish person. So that's another instance where we will see you are exempt from the requirements of Peter Chamor. V'hanosen lo b'kabbalah, and where it is given to a non-Jewish person as a Kabbalah. It says on the screen there, in receivership. What does that mean? It means that that somebody is looking after it and any of the offspring, but the owner is going to receive a share back from the animals and from the work that's done, I think. So it's some kind of transfer of responsibility, but the owner is retaining some residual benefits of ownership. So in all of these instances, patur min ha-bechorah, the mitzvah is not activated. The requirement to redeem this firstborn animal is not imposed on such a Jew, where it is either not his, or he's sold it to a non-Jew, or he's in partnership, etc., etc. As we said, the mitzvah applies to animals which are owned by a Jew. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, beYisrael, aval lo ba'acherim. So the verse talks about the mitzvah applying to a Yisrael. It tells us the verse there in the English on the screen. I sanctified to me all the firstborn in Israel, meaning beYisrael, owned by a Jew, v'lo ba'acherim, and not owned by other people. This continues the Mishnah. Kohanim u'leviyim paturim mikal v'chomer. A Kohen and a Levi are exempt from the mitzvah of Peteh Chamor, of redeeming a donkey, from a Kal V'chomer. So the fact that it says be Yisrael is telling us something else, that you have to be a Yisrael, an Israelite, to be obligated in this mitzvah. A Kohen and a Levi also do not have to redeem donkeys, and we learn this from a Kal V'chomer. In Patru Shel Yisrael Bamidbar, if they were patur, if they were what's the word? If they were exempt from what? They oh right, sorry, that's it. Yeah, so they are exempt from Pidyon Haben. They have no obligation in redeeming their firstborn children. So if they're not obligated in redeeming their firstborn children, dinhu, all the more so, shiiftaru shalatzman, they are going to be exempt from having to redeem any animals that they own, or any donkeys that they own as well. So that is Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Base. What if the animal that is being born does not look like the right type of animal? So para sheyalda kamin chamor. What if you have a cow, a mother cow, who is giving birth to an animal that looks more like a donkey? V'chamor sheyalda kamin sus. And you have a donkey who is giving birth to an animal that looks more like a horse. Says the Mishnah, patur min ha-bechorah. So even though you've got a cow, which would also obligate a calf to need to be redeemed, since the animal does not look the way that it was supposed to look, the Mishnah says, patur min ha-bechorah. It is going to be exempt from redemption. And so too with a donkey, even though the donkey's firstborn is obviously obligated. However, it looks like a horse, and horses are not obligated in redemption, and so it is going to be exempt. Shneimar peter chamor, peter chamor. There are two instances in the Torah where the mitzvah of peter chamor are mentioned. One in Parshas Bo and one in Parshas Ki Tisa. So the Mishnah says shnei pa'amim. This mitzvah is mentioned twice in the Torah, which teaches us the following lesson. Ad sheyehei ha-yoled chamor v'ha-nolad chamor. So it's only going to apply, the halacha is only going to apply where the birth mother is a donkey and the animal born is a donkey, meaning that it looks like a donkey as well. So what then the Mishnah asks is its halacha with regards to being able to eat these animals. What's the halacha with eating these animals? Well, we would think that if it looks like a donkey, you shouldn't be allowed to eat it because we can't eat donkeys. Let's see parenthetically what the Mishnah says over here. Behema tahora sheyalda kamin behema tameya. If you have a kosher animal that gives birth to an animal which looks like a non-kosher species, mutar ba'achila, it would be permitted to eat it. Utmea sheyalda kamin behema tahora. And if you have a non-kosher animal that gives birth to a kosher animal, an animal that looks kosher, asur ba'achila, it would be forbidden to eat. Shayotze me'atamei tamei, because anything that comes out of a non-kosher animal is still going to be non-kosher nonetheless. Vayotze min hatahor tahor, and anything which comes out of a kosher animal is still going to be kosher to eat, whatever it is that it might look like. Continues the Mishnah, what about fish? Dag tamei shabala dag tahor. What if a non-kosher fish swallows a kosher fish? If you then manage to capture that non-kosher fish and you find the salmon or whatever inside, are you allowed to eat it? Says the Mishnah, mutar ba'achila. It is permitted to eat the kosher fish that was swallowed up by a non-kosher fish. Obviously, you can't eat the non-kosher fish. The tahor shabala dag tamei. But if a kosher fish swallowed a non-kosher fish, asur ba'achila, you're not allowed to eat the non-kosher fish. Lefi she'eino gidulav, because it was not where it grew up, so to speak. So even though it's inside this kosher fish, it's not going to be considered kosher at all. Mishnah Gimel. So when you redeem a male donkey, you redeem it onto a sheep. But what is going to happen if confusions arise with regards to these firstborn donkeys? So this is going to get a bit technical, but I will do my very best to explain it. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Gimel, Chamor shelo bikra. You have got a donkey who has never given birth before. V'yalda shnei zacharim. And it gives birth to 2 male donkeys. Well, which one is the firstborn? You don't know. But does it matter? The answer, no. No saying taleh echad lakohen. Because you know that with absolute certainty that the firstborn donkey was definitely male, so the Mishnah says the halacha is you go ahead and you give 1 sheep as a redemption to the kohen for this donkey. What if, however, zachar nekeva? It gives birth to a male and a female donkey, and you don't know which one it was first. So now there's an element of doubt. Says the Mishnah, however, mafrish taleh echad la'atzmo, that you can still take out, you can still separate and designate a lamb, because maybe the donkey that came out first was male, and so it needs to be redeemed. However, since there's no way of proving, we have to follow the halacha of hamotzi mechaveiro alav hara'aya, that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, or the kohen in this instance, to prove that the donkey that came out first was male. Since he cannot offer that proof, so the lamb still gets designated to be to cover the donkey, but the owner of the donkey gets to keep the sheep, the lamb, because there's this uncertainty. We don't know if the firstborn was male or female. So we're covering our bases by redeeming it, as it were, onto a sheep, but the owner gets to keep the sheep. Next example. Shtei chamarim shelo bichru. We have 2 donkeys that have never given birth before. V'yaldu shnei zacharim. And they both give birth to male donkeys. Well, that's easy, says the Mishnah. No sen shnei tzlaim lakohen. So we have 2 sheep that must be given to the kohen, because we know with absolute certainty that both firstborns were male. But, says the Mishnah, zachar nekeva. What if one of them was male and one of them was female? Or shnei zacharim and nekeva. Or these 2 donkeys, that have never given birth before, they give birth to 2 males and also a female. So there's 3 offspring from 2 mothers, and one of them is female. So the Mishnah says, no saying taleh echad la kohen. We can only know really with certainty that one of these donkeys was a firstborn. So one of these donkeys, it doesn't remain with the owner. One of them can definitely go to a kohen with certainty, because one of these firstborn animals must have been male. Shtei nekevos v'zachar. But what if the 2 mothers give birth to 2 females and a male? Or shnei zacharim u'shtei nekevos. Or they give birth to 4 offspring, 2 males and 2 females. So now we can't be absolutely certain that one of the animals was definitely a firstborn male. In which case, says the Mishnah, Ein kan lakayin klum. You can't give anything. You still redeem the animals because maybe there was a firstborn male there, but nothing goes to the Kohen because there's no certainty, and he can't prove that he is owed these things, and so that is why the animals stay with the owners. Mishnah Daled, Achas Bikra v'Achas Shelo Bikra. You've got one mother who's giving birth for the first time, and one mother who's not giving birth for the first time. V'Yaldu Shnei Zacharim. And they both give birth to 2 males. Well, that's easy because one of them is surely going to be firstborn. No saying taleh echad la kohen, so we can go ahead and give 1 sheep to the kohen. What if zachar and keva? What if one is male and one is female? Says the Mishnah, mafrish taleh echad la'atzmo. So we can. The Mishnah says that we designate a sheep, but it goes and stays with the original owner. Shneemar ufeter chamor. The mitzvah says peter chamor. Tifter b'seh, that this firstborn donkey should be redeemed on the sheep. Mina kvasim and mina izim. No, 1 second. I think I've gone too far. As it is stated, and you shall redeem the firstborn of a donkey with a lamb. Okay, so let's just backtrack a little bit. Mafrish taleh echad la'atzmo, that he designates 1 lamb for himself, because we don't know if the male was a firstborn or not. So that's why it stays with himself. Now, why do we know bichlal that we redeem it onto a sheep? Says the Mishnah, Shneemar ufeter chamor tifter b'seh, that the firstborn of a donkey is redeemed onto a lamb, which we learn from here, min ha'klasim and min ha'izim. It can be from sheep or from goats. Zachar or nekeva. It can be male or female. Gadol v'katan. It can be an old one or a young one. Tamim uvalmum. And it can be from unblemished or blemished animals. Pamim habe. And you can redeem many donkeys onto 1 sheep. So it doesn't kind of retain a particular status after the donkey has been redeemed. The Kohen could sell it back to the owner again and again and again for as many donkeys as is required. And it can be reused and re-redeemed onto multiple animals. Nichnas ladir lehis aser, says the Mishnah. So this is talking about if you don't give the Bechor to a Kohen, so then it gets tithed anyway as Maaseh Behema, as 1 out of every 10 animals. V'immeis nehenim bo, and if it dies, you can derive benefit from its carcass. So what that means is that there is still usages that you can get out of this sheep, even when it's being redeemed onto multiple donkeys in many instances. I think that's what it's saying. Hopefully, that's what it's saying. Mishnah Hey. Ein podin lo ba'egel. You don't redeem donkeys with calves. V'lo b'chaya, or with undomesticated animals. V'lo b'shchuta, with slaughtered animals. V'lo b'treifa, with treif animals, with animals that have got fatal wounds that are going to kill it within a year. V'lo b'kilayim, not with hybrid animals that have been born as a result of mixed parentage. V'lo b'koi. A koi is an animal we're not exactly sure what type of animal the koi is, and because of that uncertainty, it doesn't definitely fall into the category of sheep or goats, and therefore you can't use it to redeem a donkey. Rabbi Elazar says, Matir bakilayim, you are allowed to use a hybrid offspring, which may have been mated between sheep and goats, because it is going to still be included within the category of seh, of something from a flock, of the sheep or the goats. It's going to be one or the other. So Rabbi Elazar says you can still use that. But because of the doubts surrounding the koi, he agrees that you can't use that. Says the Mishnah, Nasanu la kohen. If you give the donkey to a kohen, ein hakohen rashai lekaymo ad sheyafrish seh tachtav. So he's not allowed to keep it until it has been redeemed onto a sheep. But then once he's done it, he can use both the sheep as well as the donkey as well. Mishnah Vav. So we're going to see in Mishnah Vav a machlokes, another opinion with regards to what we saw in Mishnah Daled. What did we see in Mishnah Daled? That the Tanna Kama holds that once it is redeemed, it is immediately redeemed. So let's see what Mishnah Vav says. Hamafrish pidyon peter chamor umes. So if you have designated the lamb for the redemption of this donkey, and then that lamb dies, so Rabbi Eliezer says, Chayavin ba'achara yuso. So then you still have to bring another lamb. So whereas that wasn't indicated to us in Mishnah Daled, when the first position was talking about this, we see here a disagreeing opinion from Rabbi Eliezer, and he's saying that if it was to die before you have actually effected the redemption, so Rabbi Eliezer says you have to bring another one. And he says not only that, but his support for this, his proof for this is from Pidyon Haben. And he says, Kachamesh Slaim Shalben, just like the 5 coins that are used to redeem a firstborn baby. Where if the money was set aside, but it hasn't been used, then if it gets lost, you'd have to go ahead and replace the money. So Rabbi Eliezer says the same would apply to this sheep. If you designated the sheep but you didn't actually redeem the donkey, you have to go ahead and get another sheep. V'chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say, Ein chayavin b'achara yuso. You're not obligated to replace it. There is no financial responsibility for the owner. And his proof for this is Kafidyon Ma'aseh Sheni, like with the redemption of Ma'aseh Sheni, the second tithe. Because over there, by fruit or money that gets redeemed in Jerusalem, if it gets lost, you don't have to bring a replacement. So that's the Chachamim's proof. Heyed Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Tzadok testified, Al Pidyon Petech Chamor Shemes, with regards to a sheep that died, which was going to be used as redemption for a donkey, she'ein kan la kohen klum, that there was no need to replace it. The priest got nothing because the firstborn donkey had already been redeemed, and so the owner had no bearing over this sheep anymore, and so when the sheep died, he didn't have to replace it for the kohen. Meis peter chamor. If the donkey dies after the lamb was designated, Rabbi Eliezer says, Yikaver, the donkey must be buried. Because the redemption, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is effective only when it's in the hands of the Kohen. So if the donkey dies before this point, you're not allowed to benefit from this donkey because it was a Peter Chamor, it needed redemption, and it wasn't redeemed according to Rabbi Eliezer. So since it is forbidden to benefit from it, you have to bury it. Umutar b'hana'ato shel taleh, but you are allowed to benefit from this sheep. The Chachamim say, Eino tzarich likaver, you don't need to bury the donkey because it has gone through a redemption on the sheep. V'hataleh lakohen, and the sheep still nonetheless goes to the kohen, stays with the kohen. And finally, for chapter 1, we have Mishnah Zion, which is what happens in the event of refusing to redeem the animal. So the Mishnah says, Lo ratza lifdoso. If you did not wish to redeem your firstborn donkey, so the Mishnah says, Orfa b'chofitz me'acharav v'kovro. So then you have to break its neck from behind, you have to chop its head off with a hatchet from behind v'kovro, and you have to bury it. So even though it would seem that this is a mitzvah in the Torah as well, that if you're not going to redeem it, you have to kill it, the Torah would clearly prefer that we do the redemption like we're supposed to. Mitzvahs pedia kodemes lemitzvahs arifa, says the Mishnah. That the mitzvah of pedia, of redemption, comes before the mitzvah of arifa, of breaking the neck, which shows us that our preference, wherever possible, is the redemption of the donkey. Shneemar v'imlo sifteh v'arafto. It says, if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And now the mitzvah brings other instances, other mitzvahs, where the Torah offers two options, but indicates its preference. So the Mishnah says, mitzvahs ye'idah kodemes lemitzvah pediyah. That when it comes to a Hebrew maidservant, the master is allowed to marry her, which is a process called ye'ud, designating the maidservant as your wife. And if not, then the owner has to allow her to be redeemed, either with the coming of age or after 6 years. So the Mishnah says, mitzvahs pediyah mitzvahs ye'idah, the mitzvah of designating and marrying this Hebrew maidservant comes before the mitzvah of redemption. Shneemar asher lo ye'ada v'hefter. If she has not been married, then she has to be redeemed and freed. Mitzvahs yibum kodemes lemitzvahs chalitza. If you have an instance of a wife who loses her husband and they haven't had children, so the Torah says that brothers are allowed to marry this wife, and that is the mitzvah of yibum. If they do not wish to go through the mitzvah of yibum, then there is a process called chalitza, which is where they essentially absolve themselves from any marital responsibilities, and that's a process called chalitza. So the mitzvah of yibum comes before the mitzvah of chalitza, which indicates to us that really that is the preference vis-a-vis the Torah. However, says the Mishnah, Barishonah, Shahayu miskavnim l'shem mitzvah. That was only at first when people's intentions were pure, and so they could go ahead and rebuild the dead brother's lineage by continuing that lineage through the brother. However, says the Mishnah V'achshav, nowadays, she'ein miskavnim l'shem mitzvah. If people were faced with this situation, this unfortunate situation, then it would seem that they wouldn't be doing it for the reasons of, is the word propagating the brother's lineage. And so that's why the halacha now is amru mitzvahs chalitza kodemes lemitzvahs yibum. So now actually halacha would prefer that people go through the chalitza process rather than the yibum process. And mitzvahs geula ba'adon hu kodem l'chol adam. Says the Mishnah to finish off this chapter that the mitzvah of redeeming by the owner, what's with this regards to? If a person sanctifies something to the Beis Hamikdash, the giver should be redeemed. So if a person, what's this in reference to? With regards to a non-kosher animal that was consecrated to the temple, so then mitzvahs geula ba'adon hu kodem l'chol adam. The mitzvah of redemption by the owner who consecrated it takes precedence over redemption by any other person. So if you sold it on to somebody else, it should still be the owner who redeems it, preferably. Sheneemar v'im lo yigael v'nimkar be'erkecha. That if it is not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your valuation, says the pasuk. So with that we say Mazel Tov on completing Perek Aleph, chapter 1 of Maseches Bechorot. And I think we've still got some time here to go into chapter 2. So if we don't have comments or questions, let's dive straight in to chapter 2, where we're talking now about the Bechor Behema Tahara. We're talking about kosher animals which require redemption. Kosher firstborn animals, like a cow, like goats, and like sheep, where again, if a non-Jew has any share in the ownership of this animal, it's going to be exempt from redemption. Says the Mishnah, if you buy the fetus of a cow of a non-Jew, or you sell to a non-Jew, even though you're not allowed to sell these animals to a non-Jew, or you've partnered up, or you've received this cow from a non-Jew, and again, there's some kind of residual benefit to the non-Jew because they benefit from the offspring, or you benefit from the offspring, but they still own the animal. Or you've given the cow to the non-Jew with this arrangement, so that the non-Jew is going to own a share of the offsprings. So in all of these cases, says the Mishnah, patur min Bechorot. So you're going to be exempt from the mitzvah of redeeming these animals. Shene'emar b'Yisrael, because it says in the pasuk, b'Yisrael aval lo ba'acherim, that the firstborns belonging to Israel, but not to others. Kohanim and Levim chayavim. And interestingly, when it comes to these animals, Kohanim and Levim are also obligated in redeeming these animals. Lo niftaru mi bechor behema tahara. They were not excused and not exempted from the mitzvah of redeeming firstborn kosher animals. Ela mi pidyon haben umi peter chamar. They've only been exempted from redeeming firstborn children and redeeming firstborn donkeys. Mishnah base. So these next two Mishnayos, you may recall, were actually in Maseches Chulin in chapter 10. So if it sounds familiar, this is why. So in Maseches Chulin, it was brought in reference to the gifts that were given to the Kohanim. What were those gifts? So with every slaughtered animal, we are supposed to give matanot, different gifts. We're supposed to give the jawbone, the forearm, and the stomach to the Kohanim. So that was where we saw the context of these Mishnayos in Maseches Chulin, and now we see it in relation to the halacha of the firstborn animals. So says the Mishnah. So if we recall, we were talking about two different types of korbanot. We were and blemishes. So we were talking about a sacrifice which could never be brought because it had a permanent mum, a permanent blemish. So there was never any chance that it could be brought. And so if it got redeemed, it would be going back to its normal status. It wouldn't have any sanctity at all. Then you have a sacrifice which could have been brought, but it got a blemish afterwards. So there is some residual sanctity that's still in play. So the Mishnah says, Kol hakodshim shekadam mum kavua le'ekdesham. If you've got an animal which got its permanent blemish before it was consecrated, before it was designated for sacrificial use, v'niftu, and then it got redeemed. So the Mishnah says, chayavim b'Bechorot v'matanos. So it's lost its status now. And if it's lost its status as a sacrifice, it's now going to get a newfound status. It could now be susceptible to being obligated in the mitzvah of a firstborn if it was to give birth. So then its firstborn would now be chayav, to be redeemed, obligated. Uv'matanos, and the priestly gifts would have to be given because it's no longer sacrificial. The yotz in lechulin, it goes out of its sacred status, it goes back to being chulin. Ligazez leheaved, with regards to being allowed to be shorn, shaved, and to be worked with for labor. Uvevladan v'chalavan mutar, their offspring and their milk are permitted for use la'achar pidyonan, after their redemption. They don't retain residual sanctity. V'shochatan b'chutz patur, and if you were to slaughter them outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you would not be liable because they are not sacrifices. Ve'enosim tumurah, and they are not going to be able to have any tumurah. We haven't learned really about tumurah yet, but tumurah is the ability to exchange, or not to change, to substitute the sanctity on a sacrifice and to put it onto another animal, it's not going to be subject to that. V'mesu yipadu. And if they die before they were redeemed, then they can still be redeemed and fed to dogs. Is that right? Yeah, and they do not require burial. Chutz min ha-bechorah min ha-maaseh, except for firstborn animals and maaseh, animals which still need to be taken as tithes because they were they were a tenth of the rest of their animals. Kol shekadam in Mishnah Gimel now. Kol shekadam hekdeshan esmumam. Let's say they were designated as a sacrifice and then they got their blemish. So that's the first instance. Or mum over lehekdeshan, or they had a temporary blemish before they were consecrated. Ulachar mikan noled lahem mum kavua, and afterwards they get a proper permanent blemish. V'nifdu, and then they get redeemed. So now they still retain some of their sanctity, and that's because they could have been brought, in theory, as a sacrifice at some point. So the Mishnah says, Paturim min ha-bechorah u'min ha-matanos. They are going to be exempted from their offspring being considered firstborn, or from having to give any gifts to the Kohanim, because you can't give these things to Kohanim. Ve'einan yotzin l'chunin. They are not completely emerging from this sacred status. They don't return to chulin, to a profane status, so they can't be worked with, etc. So ve'einon yotzin l'chunin ligazei zelehaveh. They can't be shorn, and their fur, their wool, whatever it might be, can't be utilized. Ulehaved, and they can't be worked with. Uvevladan v'chalavan asur, and their offspring and their milk are going to be forbidden for consumption and for benefit. La'achar pidyonan, after their redemption. V'ashochatan b'chutz chayav, and if you slaughter them outside of the Beis HaMikdash, then you're going to be liable because it needs to be inside. Va'osin tamura, and they can be used for tumura. V'mesu yikaveru, and if they die, they must be buried. There can't be any hana'ah. You can't even feed them to the dogs to be able to benefit from them because they still retain a status. Mishnah Daled. We're going back to this arrangement known as kablanus. We saw this in our first Mishnahs of each perek. So kablanus is where a partner takes care of an animal and he will get a share of the offspring, but he's not responsible to pay for it. So the Mishnah says that you've got Hamakabel, you've got one who receives Son Barzel min Anachri. Now literally this would mean iron sheep. So this isn't the name of like some new Marvel film, the Iron Sheep. Son Bakar is a halachic terminology that refers to, it says here on the screen, a guaranteed investment. So what would happen is you could have sheep that are given to a Jewish shepherd, and no matter what, the Jew will have to pay a flat rate back at the end to the non-Jewish owner, and they're gonna split the offspring as well. So that's the Son Barzel. It's this guaranteed investment where the Jew is going to have an animal to work with and would be able to benefit from the offspring of this animal and from the products of this animal, but it's still ultimately owned by the non-Jewish owner. So that is Son Barzel. So in an instance of Son Barzel, he's going to have to pay this flat rate back at the end of their period of employment. But if the Jew has no money, then the non-Jew can claim from this Jewish shepherd until he has got his money back. So, says the Mishnah, Makabel Son Barzel min Anachri. You've got this Jew who has this Son Barzel arrangement with a non-Jew. So the Mishnah says, Vlados Paturim, the offspring of this animal are going to be exempted from needing to be redeemed because there is still some residual ownership to the non-Jewish owner. But, says the Mishnah, Uvlade Vlados Chayavin, but the next generation down, So the original generation and the next generation of offspring, they are not going to need to be redeemed because the non-Jew is still enjoying benefit from owning them. But the next generation is going to be obligated because the non-Jew only has a link to the original and to that first generation and that second generation. So anything beyond that, the non-Jew is not going to have any ownership over. And so it's going to be exempt. Sorry, these ones are going to be obligated in Pidyon. Says the Mishnah, He'emid vlados tachas imosehem. What if they stipulate that the offspring are going to be available for collection? They are going to replace the mother if the mother ends up dying. So if the Jew can't pay the flat rate, so he's going to give the offspring back to the owner instead of the mother. So then, in which case, says the Mishnah, Valde Vlados Paturim, then that second generation is going to be patur because it's still got ownership under the non-Jew. But the next generation from that, the third generation down, Uvavalde Valde Vlados, the third generation down, Chayavin, is going to be obligated for Pidyon. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that without any other stipulations, afilu ad asara doros paturim, then even up to 10 generations, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the owner can claim back. Because the non-Jew is going to have ownership and is going to have the right to claim from any of these generations if the Jew still owes some of this money back to the non-Jew. He is going to have residual ownership over all of the offspring of this mother animal, however many generations that could go on for. So unless they had stipulated and made some other kind of arrangement, any subsequent generations are going to go potentially to this non-Jew, and therefore they won't be obligated in the mitzvah of redemption. Mishnah, hey, says the Mishnah, Rachel sheyalda kaminez. If you have a female sheep who gives birth to a sheep that looks more like a goat, ve'ez sheyalda kamin Rachel, or you have a goat that gives birth to an animal that looks more like a sheep, patur min bechorah, they are going to be exempt from the mitzvah of redemption because they have to look like the same species as the mother. Says the Mishnah, if they are somewhat similar, and it has some of the characteristics of the mother, then the Mishnah says chayav. It is going to be obligated to be brought. It's going to be obligated to be up for redemption. Mishnah Vav is going to be talking about similar instances to what we saw with regards to the donkeys. So cases of doubt where we're not sure which animal was born first and if it's male, if it's female. So we're going to see permutations of this again with regards to these other types of animals. So the Mishnah says, Rachel shelavikra v'yalda shnei zacharim. If you have a female sheep who has never given birth before and gives birth to two male offspring, v'yatsu shnei rashein ke'echad. Not only that, but the two heads seem to be emerging at the same time. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says shneim la kohen. Both of these animals need to be given or need to be redeemed to the Kohen. Shneimar hazcharim la Hashem. It says in the pasuk hazcharim, which is plural. So according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, they are both going to have kedushas bechor. They're going to have sanctity as a bechor. Chachamim, on the other hand, say no. When it talks about plural of males, it's not talking about more than one male could be obligated. It means that there's a plurality of species. We have different species that we're talking about. We're not so we're talking about goats and we're talking about sheep and we're talking about cows. That's what it means when it talks about how all of these males need to be given to Hashem. So the Chachamim say, it's impossible that you could have an instance of giving two animals as a firstborn, because only one of them is the firstborn. One of them stays with the owner, and one of them goes to the Kohen. So by the way, with regards to these kosher animals, if there's a doubt, then the halacha is that they have to be left to develop a blemish, because they do have some kind of importance and some kind of sanctity, so they can't just be messed about with. They have to be left to develop a blemish in the field, and then once they've got a blemish, then they can be eaten with particular stringencies. So the first opinion that we see there, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you give both of them to the Kohen. Chachamim say only one of them to the Kohen. Rabbi Tarfon says HaKohen Bore Lo Esayafe. Rabbi Tarfon says that the Kohen gets to choose whichever one is best, and he gets the more robust animal. Why should he get the most robust animal? So I would have thought it's because, the Kohanim should always win. But I believe there's also an appreciation that the stronger animal would have likely come out first. So Rabbi Tarfon says that the better animal goes to the Kohen. Rabbi Akiva says, Meshamnin beinehem, we evaluate the two animals. V'hasheni yireh ad she'ista'ev. So Rabbi Akiva says we assess the value between them. The Kohen gets the lesser animal. V'hasheni yireh ad she'ista'ev, and the other one has to go and be left in the field to graze until it becomes blemished. So it stays with the owner, but he has to wait for it to become blemished. And once it's blemished, then it loses that ability to be redeemed as a firstborn, and then he can shecht it, and then he can eat it. So until then, it has to graze. V'chayev b'matanos, and when he slaughters it, he has to give the gifts to the Kohen as he would any other normal animal. Rabbi Yossi Poter. Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that you don't have to give the gifts to the Kohen. Meis echad mehem. What if one of them dies? So if one of these animals die, says the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon Omer. So 1 second now. Before Rabbi Tarfon said that you have to give the best one to the Kohen. Why we would expect him to say the same thing here instead? Rabbi Tarfon Omer Yachloku. Rabbi Tarfon says that you split the value, you divide the remaining lamb, and split the value amongst the Kohen and the owner. Rabbi Akiva says no. That the burden of proof rests on the Kohen. If he can't prove that the animal that's still alive was the firstborn, then he has no rights to it. Zachar and Nekeva, and if the offspring that came out of this mother, female sheep that had never given birth before, one was male and one was female, ein kan lakohen klum, then nothing goes to the Kohen at all, because there's no way of proving conclusively that the firstborn animal was male. Very good. So, says Mishnah Zayin, we're continuing with these examples. Says the Mishnah, Shtei Rachelos Shalot Bikru. You've got two mothers who have not given birth. V'yaldu Shnei Zacharim, and both give birth to males. No Shnei Shnei Hen LeKohen. So then you can give both of them to the Kohen. Very straightforward. Zachar and Nekeva. If one is male, one is female. Hazachar LeKohen. Then the male can go to the Kohen. Shnei Zacharim and Nekeva. If you've got two males and a female, well, now we don't know. Now we don't know with any certainty that they are both firstborns, but we know that one of them definitely was. So the Mishnah says, Echad lo ve'echad la kohen. Sorry, I need to scroll down. One of them goes to the owner, and one of them goes to the Kohen. Rabbi Tarfon Omer. Rabbi Tarfon says, consistent with what he said before, HaKohen boreh lo esayafe. Rabbi Tarfon says that the Kohen gets the better of the two. Rabbi Akiva Omer Meshamnin beinehem. We evaluate the value, and the Kohen gets the lesser one. but the one that stays with the owner, v'hasheni yireh ad she'istoev. The second one has to stay in the field. It has to graze until it becomes blemished, and once it's blemished, you can slaughter it and you can eat it. V'chayev b'matanos, and the kohen gets the gifts as well. Rabbi Yossi poter. Rabbi Yossi says that the kohen does not get these three gifts. Meis echad mehen, if one of these firstborn, one of these males die. Rabbi Tarfon omer yachloku. Rabbi Tarfon says they have to divide the value of the remaining lamb. So he seems to be changing his opinion again. Rabbi Akiva Omer, no. Hamotzi mechavero lavaraya. The proof is on the Kohen. If he can't prove that the remaining firstborn was his, then he can't have any rights to it at all. Shtei nekevos v'zachar. If you have two females and a male, or shnei zacharim u'shtei nekevos, or you have two males and two females, so there's no way of proving that one of them was definitely a firstborn. Ein kan lakohen klum. The Kohen gets nothing. Mishnah Ches. Here we've got issues of doubt regarding the mother and the children. Achas bikra v'achas shelo bikra. I've got one mother that's given birth and one mother that hasn't given birth. V'yoldu shnei zacharim, and they give birth to two males. So now the halach is easy. Echad lo ve'echad lakohen. One goes to him and the other one goes to the kohen, because one of them is definitely a firstborn male. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, HaKohen Boreh Lo Yafeh. Rabbi Tarfon says the Kohen gets to choose the better one. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Meshamnin Beinehem. We evaluate the two animals, V'hasheni Yireh Ad Shistoev. The animal that remains with the owner is left in the field to graze until it develops a blemish, in which case it can be slaughtered and eaten, V'chayev b'matanos. And the gifts go to the Kohen. Rabbi Yossi Poter, Rabbi Yossi says, the gifts do not go to the Kohen. And here we have his reason. It's taken us 3 Mishnahs, but we finally have his reason. Shahaya Rabbi Yossi Omer, because Rabbi Yossi says, Kol shechalifav b'yad Kohen patur min hamatanos, that whenever these replacements are going to the Kohen, so the gifts do not go to the Kohen. Rabbi Meir, however, Mechayev, Rabbi Meir says that you are obligated to give the gift. So it would seem that Rabbi Meir is the Tanna Kama, is the same authoritative position in all 3 Mishnahs, but is only mentioned explicitly over here. Says the Mishnah, Meis echad mehen. If one of these animals dies, Rabbi Tarfon Omer yachloku, then you split the remaining animal. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, no, hamotzi mechavera lavaraya, that you have to, the Kohen has to prove that he should have any ownership over this. Zachar and Akeva, and if the two mothers, one of which has given birth before, one of which hasn't, and they give birth to a male and a female, says the Mishnah, Ein kan lakohen klum. The Kohen doesn't have rights to either of them, because there's no way of proving that the firstborn animal was actually male. Finally, to finish off for tonight, to finish off Perek Beis, Mishnah Tes, Yotze Dofen. If you have got an animal that is born by caesarean section, V'haba acharav, and any offspring that come after an animal which has come through caesarean section. So we have to realize that Peter Rechem, that when we've been talking about the firstborn of the womb, so the implication is that it has been born naturally, which means that if it was not born naturally, it was born by a caesarean, then it's going to lose that status as a firstborn, potentially. So it leaves us with a suffix. Yotze dofen v'haba acharav. If the first animal was born by caesarean, and then there were other animals that were born after it, or another animal that was born after it, so now we have a suffix. So Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Rabbi Tarfon says, Shnehem yiru ad she'istoavu. Both of these animals need to be sent out to the field to graze, because they are both a suffix. Because maybe the one that came out of the womb in the caesarean is the firstborn animal, but it wasn't born naturally. And maybe the second one, which was born naturally, might have been really halachically the firstborn animal, but there's a problem, it's already given birth to another animal beforehand. So both of these animals get sent out to graze until they develop a blemish, at which point they can be slaughtered, ve'achlu, and they can be eaten, b'muman labalin. They can be eaten in their blemished state by the owners. Rabbi Akiva says, Shneihen einan bechor. Both of these animals are not considered halachic firstborns, because caesarean section is not a halachic natural birth. So harishon mishum sheino peter rechem. The first one because it doesn't meet the biblical criteria of peter rechem, of being the firstborn of the womb. V'hasheni mishum shekidmu acher. And the second one is not a bechor because there was an animal that was previously born from the same mother. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we say Mazel Tov on completing chapter 2 and chapter 1. And that's all for this week. And we will see you again next time on Mishnah Mastery. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful